complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side, and like, man, messed up.
This is another episode in my ongoing mini-series on Israel-Palestine. Hunger the Die Merchant, he's on tonight. Friend of mine, we met in person at the last event and had a great conversation, great time together. And so I'm really glad to be finally welcoming him to my show. Those who aren't familiar, he's Lebanese Christian and so has a good deal of real-world experience with the Israel-Palestine issue. He has an interesting perspective. I know a little bit of it, maybe not necessarily what you'd expect, but nonetheless, I think a valuable voice on the topic. But before we get into that, just a brief word from our sponsor, Axios. All right, Hunger the Die Merchant, welcome to the show. How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here, man.
Yeah, I'm really excited to speak with you. You know, you and I have spoken a number of times off air, and I'm glad to finally bring you on the show. I think you have a very interesting perspective. But just to kind of briefly launch into it, do you want to give some details on your background and why you're an authority on this topic?
I wouldn't go that far. I'm not a. I wouldn't classify myself as authority, but I have, so for my background, I am a Lebanese American. Of my parents are from Lebanon, which borders Israel and or Palestine, whatever you want to call it. And the one thing that that stands me out about that, not just the regular brownoid, immigrant, but like I actually lived in the Middle East. I lived in Lebanon for many years as a teenager. So I was actually, I became much more familiar with the Middle East, Middle Eastern politics, the things happening in the society, and and like specifically the issue of Palestine and the Palestinians. I met Palestinians in real life. They told me stories, but like I never really looked into it as much as I should have until things happened in Gaza. In October 2023.
I think that, like a lot of us, what happened in October was sort of I want to say a reignition of something that had been smoldering for a long time. It did kind of seem like, the only contact I had with Palestine was basically the Palestinian flag and bio, right? Of kind of, generic progressive activists. And
many such cases.
Right. And obviously, I've been kind of on a deep dive into the relationship between the state of Israel and America, both when it comes to kind of, weird evangelical dispensationalists, but then also in the halls of power. And that was definitely something that was going on, growing up in the George Bush era where, Israel was our greatest ally, where Israel had this sort of mystique surrounding it. But at the same time, that seemed to be sort of a static thing. There wasn't anything really changing in that relationship. Obviously, Obama didn't like Netanyahu quite as much, but let's be honest, we were still fully lockstep in support. And then obviously, we've seen a massive shakeup of the political landscape since the war really that's been going on since October of last year. And so, I think a lot of people are more interested in the issue than they would have been previously. And, you and I were talking before we went live about whose issue this should be. And I think that we're probably both on the same page that it's like, regardless of if we should be forced to care, Americans are forced to care, right? Our Israel sort of has our government by the short hairs and is, extorting massive amounts of money out of them. And that does affect, normal Americans. But do you want to offer some perspective on, the relationship between, Middle Eastern Christians generally, and then who you consider that issue to be kind of native to, if you see what I mean?
Yeah. So when it comes to the Palestinian, topic itself, and America's relationship to the topic, everyone was saying months ago, people like Charlemagne, Mandrill, all the guys in our sphere, all the guys who have attended the conferences, the Schildings conferences and the OGC conferences, we all had the opinion of, this is not my problem. Why should I get involved in the issue of two desert tribes, fighting it out in fighting out a bloody conflict, 4,000 miles away. And that's not incorrect. I mean, there's some things about it that's incorrect, but that's a completely valid perspective. Like, Americans shouldn't have to care, what happens in the Middle East. If it wasn't for oil or the GWAT, the global war on terrorism in the 2000s, America would not really have anything to do in the Middle East, and we wouldn't be talking about this today. But as you mentioned, there are certain people in power and certain people in Washington D.C. that are very this is their number one issue. And it's obvious that this is their number one issue. And we see this not just in the backlash to the college campus protests, but we see this in the dozens of anti-Semitism laws that are passing on a state by state issue. Why does Florida have an anti-Semitism law at a state level? I mean, this is obviously the result of things like, the lobbying of certain powerful interests. So this puts America in the position of, we've already declared ourselves to be on one side of this issue without really knowing what the hell is going on.
Well, and this is something I think about, right? Because there was a uptick in what some people have described as counter jihad in the 2000s, right? And it was this desire to paint the grand story of civilization, right, on the entire world as a throwdown between, the civilized secular West and Islam writ large. And don't get me wrong, right? We do have the Crusades, right? That is a conflict that's happened before. But from the Crusades to, the late 20th, 21st century, I mean, that wasn't really an active conflict. This idea that these are two civilizations that are constantly at each other's throats is just not real. It's not true. And, don't get me wrong, like, the Middle East has been fractious for my entire life. But we go back, 200 years, and it's effectively a backwater, right? This is not the kind of focus of world politics. And I think that that's probably a healthier state of affairs.
Yeah, and on that point exactly, with the exception of certain areas of Eastern Europe, the Muslim Christian, civilizational clash, the clash of civilizations between Muslims and Christians, with the exception of Eastern Europe, pre-World War I, has been dead for 400, 600 years. None of our very, very far back ancestors had to deal with this until the 16th century. That issue died, except in the case of Eastern Europe with the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire, declined precipitously afterwards and was just no longer in existence by the end of World War I, which was 1918. So that clash itself, I don't want to say it's artificial. I don't want to say there's no such thing as a clash of civilizations, but that issue was dead until basically the arrival of Israel, and until the GWAT and American entry into the Middle East and many of its other consequences. There was no Muslim immigration. There was extremely little Muslim immigration into the West pre-1948. And the majority of people who immigrated to the West from the Middle East were actually Christians. People specifically Lebanese Christians, Syrian Christians, Armenians, Greeks. The former subjects of the Ottoman Empire, Egyptians, the former subjects of the Ottoman Empire. They all came. They were like 90+% Christian when they arrived in the West, and specifically America.
Well, and that's a very good point. And there's sort of this push and pull we see with, and I'll have to be delicate here, but people connected to, my favorite Middle Eastern democracy, right? Where we sort of have the right-wing Zionist types who are creating the wars that create these migrant crises, right? That are, turning cities into dust, creating, entities like ISIS, for example, which is very much tied to Israeli intelligence. And then on the other end, you have these like left-wing types who are facilitating the NGOs that sort of bring them here. And again, I just see that as one of the many reasons why this is such a problem. Because look, like, I don't necessarily care about the existence of Pakistani Muslims as a concept, but when Birmingham is 40% Pakistani Muslim, all of a sudden that changes the calculus quite dramatically. And so when we're talking about this issue, and I spoke to Thomas about this a few weeks ago, and I got a decent amount of pushback from Europeans who have kind of bought into that counter jihad line. And look, I get it, right? I can understand why, as a European, and I mean, certainly I don't want it either, would want to oppose, mass Muslim migration. But you're fighting a symptom, not the cause, is my view on and Tommy Robinson's a great example, right? Someone who hates immigration but loves the state of Israel. It's like my brother in Christ here. You've basically been played completely and totally.
Yeah, and you don't have to, like, it's extremely natural to not want, 30, 20 million Muslim migrants in your own country and still, say that the Palestinians deserve a homeland. Like, those are not the same thing at all. I don't want 10 million Chinese people in my neighborhood. That doesn't mean that doesn't mean China should not exist as its own country and homeland.
So I wanted to talk with you about the character of the Palestinian people. You said you had something to add on that note.
Yeah. So before I get to the character of the Palestinian people, I mean, I do want to mention a little bit of the history, and you might talk about this later with other guests, but basically, I wanted to dispel this one notion and then talk about the history of Palestine and Israel. And the one notion is that everyone kind of believes. It's like the classic 2005 American mode of thinking was like, these people have been at war in the desert, for the past 3,000 years, and it's an ethnic blood feud that is completely unsolvable and has been going on forever, and it's just a shit show. So therefore we should either civilize them, or we should never get involved at all. And that's not the case. And that's not the case because this issue is literally less than 100 years old. A couple of days ago was the 76th anniversary of Israeli Independence Day. So 1948 was 76 years ago, and that was the anniversary of the creation of Israel. And even before that, like, this issue basically started during World War One, as almost all issues of today started during World War One, when it comes to geopolitics. So we have the 1917, the Balfour Declaration, and where the Zionist movement in Europe pressured the British government and Lord Balfour to promise them a homeland in the Middle East for European Jews of Jews of European ancestry. And that's what kind of kicks it all off. And then you have Britain's many adventures in the Middle East during World War One. Defeating the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, founding the modern Arab states like Saudi Arabia, founding the Kingdom of Jordan, founding the former Kingdom of Iraq. You had the British Protectorate of Egypt and the Kingdom of Egypt for a brief time. So this is not like, but pre World War One, pre 1914. Muslim, Christian, Jewish relations were in the Middle East and in the Ottoman Empire were very much normal. My great grandparents and my grandparents were Ottoman subjects. They lived in the Ottoman Empire as Christians, and they went about their normal life. They were yeoman farmers. They had olive trees and citrus fruits, and they had land. They could own land. They had to pay a jizya and they were subjects of the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan. They had to pay taxes, but everyone hates paying taxes. So that's one issue. But life was completely normal. Like, Jews were indigenous to the region. There were no Jewish pogroms. There were no Muslim Jewish massacres. The Christian Muslim wars had stopped a millennium and a half ago. with the defeat of the Byzantine Empire, there were still Christians in the Middle East. You know, Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived in the territory of Palestine uninterrupted for 1,500 years, and it was just never an issue. There was no uprisings, there was no racial tension or sectarian tension, until basically World War One, and that's 1,500 years of just more or less peace. And the only violence was the only violence was like a change in rulerships. Like before the Ottomans, it was the Seljuks. Before the Seljuks, it was the Mamluks. Before the Mamluks, it was the Umayyads and the Abbasids, for example. But like the people themselves and the religions of the people, didn't change. There was no mass migrations going on. Like Jews had been living in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt, Jordan for over 2,000 years, and it just wasn't a problem. But it was a problem in Europe, as we saw in the mid 20th century, and
Well,
the many expulsions that happened the 1,000 years after beforehand.
I think that the Ottoman Empire is kind of fascinating to me because you will oftentimes hear the idea that multiculturalism doesn't work. And that's true with an asterisk, right? It's true in a sort of an atomized liberal society. I think that we are seeing that proved more and more every day. But you can have a multi-ethnic empire, right? It's just that you have to have formalized systems set up, right? You have to have, I believe the term that Turks came up with was ethnarchs, right? Which is to
Yeah.
steal a Family Guy bit. You'd have like the king of black people, or the king of, XYZ group. And that would be the representative to kind of, adjudicate disputes between one group and another. And so, a lot of the counter jihad guys will kind of speak derisively of the jizya, call people dhimmis who are kind of too soft on the Islamic world. And I see what they're doing, right? If you're in England, you should not be ruled by Muslims, certainly. But at the same time, it's like, well, okay, like if you have an empire, how else are you going to run it as a dominant ethnic group, right? Because
You're responsible for these people. I
right,
mean,
and we can look at it
every
and say,
empire
like,
is, yeah.
I may not like that, I wouldn't want to pay it, but you also have to admit that it did work. It produced a relatively functional society, which we look at our current system, it clearly cannot.
Yeah, and people's everyday interface with the government was extremely local. I mean, what happened in Lebanon with my great grandparents, for example. They went to their village elders or whatever, or their village leader, and the village leader would go to the local governor, who was most of the time a Christian, because the area was majority Christian, and then that governor would interface with the Ottoman Empire, and that's just what it was. The daily interface between the government and the people and the subjects themselves was extremely minimal. Most people were just peasants. All people throughout history were majority peasants, and so that was your life. You just tended to your farm. You worked your business, you pay taxes, and then you carried on with your life, and you participated in your religious traditions and ceremonies. And it was very hands off. It was actually very libertarian in a sense. The government had absolute power, and the closer you were to the center of the empire, the more you felt the presence of the government. But if you were out in the peripheries, like in the Middle East, and in the Ottoman case, that it just wasn't a huge factor in daily life until World War One.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and the kind of consolidation of power that both the world wars allowed has been kind of ridiculous. Like you actually, and look, I'm no expert on Middle Eastern history, but you sort of see a somewhat similar thing happen with decolonialization, right? Which is that technically all of these countries are no longer under, direct European occupation. But at the same time, it's like, well, they've got American military bases there. They've got the IMF and the World Bank constantly kind of like circling around like sharks. And to me, I think it's an interesting dynamic just because, you have this on paper freedom. But if you just kind of like scrubbed that away and look at what's actually happening, these people have they have much more power kind of forced on them than they did under a technically colonial or a technically, monarchical system, which I just think is kind of an interesting dynamic that the core claim of kind of like liberal representative democracy, right, is this idea that it will net you more personal freedom. And maybe it does if your sole metric is like, how much gay sex you can have. But right, if you look at it, in kind of a more holistic sense, it's like, well, what freedom have we really gained?
Uh, None. We've lost many freedoms actually over the past century and more so, especially when it comes to the concept of like government overreach. You know ruling these societies. I want to go back to Oren's book, The Total State, which I haven't read. I ordered it, but I haven't read it yet. But the concept of the book is that throughout the ages, there's been an increase of the centralization of government, and that government takes over, these social institutions that were previously, non-governmental, that were previously more bottom up, or not even bottom up. They were more organic. They were organic and bottom up, and those slowly became rival powers that the total state had to bring under control. And we've lost so many of those freedoms. Like there was more order actually. Those societies were very well ordered. It was centered around the religion, the church, community, the farm, the economy, that stuff. That was much more localized, and we just don't really have that anymore.
So I want to get back to the issue at hand, uh, and go back to the sort of the the nature of Palestinians. So do you want to explain the the problems that Palestinians have caused in other countries? Because I think one of the dynamics that you see all the time is a lot of the Middle Eastern world likes to, champion the cause of Palestinians with rhetoric, but they are sort of unwilling to invite Palestinians into their own countries, sort of to the glee of Zionist types. Why is that? And have there been countries that have had problems with major Palestinian immigration?
Well, yeah. So there have been there have been many such cases, and on that point exactly, the history of the Arabs and the Palestinians is a very complicated history, but you can't explain that history without talking about the foundation of Israel. And so I'll talk as briefly as I can about the foundation of Israel. So in the late 1800s, early 19th century, late 19th century, you have the influx of Jewish immigrants into the Middle East, into Ottoman territories, specifically Palestine. In the 1880s and 90s, this starts off as a trickle. A couple of thousand Jews leave Europe from the Zionist movement, inspired by the Zionist movement, move to the territory of Palestine, which is under the Ottomans at that time. And they buy land, they build mosques, they set up their kibbutz or Jewish communities. And it's a slow trickle of immigration of European Jews into the area. And then the British take over post World War One and the collapse of the Ottomans. And the British make a promise. We promise the Jews, you will have a state in the territory of Palestine. And so the trickle of migration becomes more of a flood, and thousands and tens of thousands of Jews start moving into the British occupied Palestine. And they buy land. Again, they buy land, they start communities, they start synagogues, the whole shebang. There were already Jews there. That's the thing. Like, there were already Arab Jews living in Palestine, and that have lived in Palestine for 2,000 years. They never really left. The territory. The people didn't change. The genetic evidence we have says the people didn't change. There was no mass migrations, and even after the Muslims had taken over in the 6th century, the Arabs didn't really move in. it's just the locals adopted Islam as their religion, as the religion of their occupiers. So so early 1900s, the Jews move in to the territory of Palestine and they start buying up land. So by the end of the mandate, Jews own between 5 to 10% of the land in Palestine, and yeah, 5 to 10% of the land. Basically nothing. And the majority of the people there, I think Jews were less than 10% during World War One, but by the end of the mandate in 1948, they were a third. So they were a third of the population, and they owned 10% of the land. And what happens from there? The Zionist movement takes over the country, and the best book to read about this is from Elian Pape. Elian Pape is is an Israeli French historian, a revisionist historian, and he has a book, an excellent book. I've been reading it recently, actually, called "The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine," and that the entire and that from the very beginning, the Zionist movement, the it was a premeditated act. They had planned to expel the Palestinian people from the Palestinian land as early as the 1910s and 20s. This again, and he shows us in the archival evidence. This was premeditated. They knew what they wanted to do. They planned how to do it for decades, and then when the British finally got tired of being an empire, they finally succeeded. And through the use of violence and force and intimidation, so on and so forth, massacred many Palestinians, massacred thousands of Palestinians, and caused hundreds of thousands of people to flee the conflict zone. And those hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, it was about 800,000, almost a million Palestinians left Palestine in 1948 and 1947. And they were internally displaced people. A lot of them went to the West Bank, but many of them went to Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Egypt. And that's how we have this influx of refugees. And the stories Palestinians tell themselves is that this expulsion is called the Nakba. The Nakba translates into the disaster, or the disaster or the catastrophe. And this catastrophe of almost a million Palestinians being forced at bayonet point and gunpoint to leave the homes and farms and businesses they had owned for generations, for hundreds of years, that the indigenous people of the land had to flee their homes, and that they were not allowed to come back to their homes because this is now a new country. This land now belongs to a Jew from Brooklyn, and we're going to give this random Brooklyn Jew who's never been to Palestine, because he's Jewish, your farm now belongs to him. And whatever property rights, whatever deed, whatever paperwork you had is completely invalid because we are a new country and we're going to steal your territory, your business, and your property. So this is the background of the expulsion of the Palestinians into the surrounding Arab countries. 800,000. They went to Lebanon, again, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, the surrounding countries. They fled at bayonets and gunpoint. And so when they got there, they waited. They waited in camps. They waited in apartment buildings and residential areas for the Arab states to liberate them, to liberate their land and their property. The thing about the Palestinians was that they never really had a state. I mean, they were subjects of the Ottomans beforehand, and when the British were in charge, they set up Muslim councils to administer, Muslim and Christian Palestinians. But those were like very, very limited government bodies, and they were because they were under British occupation, and and during the many, many Arab uprisings against British rule, the British cracked down on these governmental bodies. And so the Palestinian local leadership, the local councils and leadership organization, was handicapped and struck down by the British during the occupation to the benefits of the Zionists. The British did not treat the Zionists and the Arabs, equally for many reasons, as the Balfour Declaration showed. They were not treated equally under the Mandate, and the British had continuously been asking the Arabs, like, please give some land to the Jews because we promised them a state, and therefore, if they need a viable state, you have to give up some of your land to give to the Jews. And the locals just said, absolutely not. What the hell is wrong with you? This is my land. This is my farm. This is my business. You're asking me to give up. You're asking me to give up the property that my family owned for centuries or for 1,000 years to a random Polish immigrant that got here 2 years ago. Like, this is completely insane. No one would ever accept these conditions. And there's a great Jewish word. It's chutzpah. And you know what chutzpah means. It's audacity, the absolute audacity to go up to an Arab family and say, the house that your great grandparents built can't be yours anymore. You have to move somewhere else, and we're going to give that to somebody else. By government dictate. The audacity of these people, and this is what I'm passionate about this issue, because this happened to my people. Like, I'm not Palestinian, I'm not Muslim, but I consider the Middle Eastern Christians, regardless of the borders, because all Middle Eastern Christians are extremely similar, and there were no borders between Arab Christians pre World War One. There were no like real borders, actually. So, like, this happened to what I consider to be my people, to be Arab Christians, as well as Muslims, because Muslims were the majority. It happened to them as well. So that's how the state of Israel was created in 1948. I can go into much more detail, but I know where we don't have two more hours to go through. So that's a very basic rundown of what happened until 1948.
So fair enough. That's interesting. There's some. I didn't realize how contiguous the Middle Eastern Christian population was. We talked earlier about the fact that for quite a long time those three different religious groups lived relatively peaceably one with another. And I think that's sort of an interesting thing as well, if we're attacking this narrative of the war on terror, right? Which is, well, okay, like if we're here fighting against these evil savage Muslims because they hate Christians and they hate Jews, well, why did that start? Because obviously, if these Christian populations have been here for 2,000 years, have been here for 1,500 years, this if they had a genocidal hatred that whole time, they weren't particularly good at it, right?
No, it didn't happen. I mean, there were many internal problems in the Ottoman Empire, but most of these, there was no general ethnic conflict. If there like obviously but obviously in the case of human relationships, some people don't like other people, and that escalates to violence and escalates into some murders. But that's a very local thing. This is not a general, like, the Christian population is fighting the Jewish population, or the Muslim population is fighting the Christian population. That didn't really happen anymore after the creations of after the empires were settled. After the conquests happened, like I said, the local population didn't change. The local population didn't migrate. We have the genetic studies. The people in Palestine are the same Canaanites that were there 3,000 years ago. The people in Lebanon are the same Canaanites and Phoenicians that were there 4,000 years ago. The people didn't really change. It was just the leader. It was just who did you pay taxes to at the end of the day?
Well, and that's an interesting point. Look, I'm no geneticist, right? But there is a robust debate to be had about the origins of the people currently ruling the state of Israel, right? How close their genetic ties really are to that land.
Yeah, no, it's actually a very big debate, and what the genetic studies show is that the Palestinian Christians have the highest, have the most compatibility with the ancient Canaanites, and that there, in the case of the Ashkenazis, which are the European Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews, they do have Semitic DNA. They do have Semitic, and or Canaanite DNA in them. It's very small, actually. It's like, I think, less than a quarter. Probably less than a quarter, I think, of the Jewish DNA, the Ashkenazi DNA, is native. This is just from genetic studies. This is just from that land. But one of the myths of Israel, two of the myths of Israel, is that, one, we are the indigenous inhabitants because the Bible said so. There were Jews living there, and that they were. This is like a biblical record of our existence there, and that, two, there was no people there after the Jews left, after the Jews were expelled. Both of those things are not true. The Jews that were there in Israel, in Israel and Palestine, all converted. They converted to Christianity, and they became Christians. And then when the Muslims when the Arab Muslims came in, they converted to Islam again. Many of them did, not all of them. There were still Christians who held on, and that's just what happened. The people didn't change. They went with the flow. A lot of them did it to avoid taxes. Actually, a lot of them converted because they didn't want to pay the jizya, and because they would have privileges and access to government services if they were Muslim, whereas they didn't have that in the case of if they were still Christian or Jewish.
So one of the things that I think is essential to this is to view both sides in this Israel-Palestine conflict as fallible ultimately. Right? You have this, and I lose patience with our guys very, very quickly when they talk about the state of Israel, because on one hand they view them as like incredibly intelligent supervillains, right? Who everything is always, exactly according to plan. And you see some of the converse as well, which is like, oh, these Palestinians are perfect angels who've never done anything wrong. And I think that the infallibility of Israel, that narrative is fast coming apart, right? The fact that their bases that have F-35s are getting bombed by Iranian drones, that shows you that everything is not working out how they want it to. But do you want to talk about the real kind of mistakes and the real like wrong things, I guess, to put it in simple terms, the Palestinians have done?
Oh, 100%. There's no such thing. There are, like, when it comes to collectives and peoples, there are no innocent victims. The Jews were not innocent from what they did in Europe in the early 20th century. They did a lot of Jews did a lot of bad things. You can't blame all Jews, but a lot of Jews, undeniably, a lot of Jews did a lot of bad things in the early 20th century, specifically in Germany. That's 100% true. And things happened a decade later that we don't have to go into. But yeah, that those events occurred. A lot of Jews died in the 1940s. That's all I'll say. A lot of Jews died in Europe in the 1940s. And so the case with Palestine, even before any of those things happened, there was a Zionist movement, and they were perpetrating these crimes in Palestine. And so the Palestinians became victims of these crimes as well. However, after they were expelled, and after the Arabs failed to remove the state of Palestine, they were on their own. They had to take stock of their situation and do what they can to, for a noble cause, for the cause of getting their land back, retrieving the land of their ancestors that they had owned for hundreds of thousands, that they had owned for thousands of years, and that they were it was an undeniable crime that Israel perpetrated ethnic cleansing against them and forced them to leave and stole their land, their property, their livestock, their farms, their businesses, all of those things. That was undeniably a crime, and it was ethnic cleansing. But what the Palestinians did was stir shits in Arab countries, because they became very radicalized. They became radicalized, and they became armed, and they were helped by many Arab states for their own interests. Arab states have a long history of using the Palestinians to advance their own interests. The Egyptians use the Palestinians, the Jordanians use the Palestinians, the Syrians use the Palestinians to further Egyptian and Jordanian and Syrian interests, not to further Palestinian interests. But this resulted in them having a lot of weapons and having a lot of radical ideology behind them. And so one of the early things that happened that the Palestinians did was in 1970 they tried to overthrow the Jordanian government. They tried to overthrow the regime of King, I believe it was King Hussein. King Hussein of Jordan. They would try to overthrow the Jordanian government, take it over, make it Palestinian, and use Jordan as a platform to, launch another war against Israel. And the Jordanians just were not going to accept that, at all. And so they put it down. They killed thousands of Palestinians, and they forced many of them again to flee to other countries. Excuse me. Most principally, Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat was the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was formed in the 50s and 60s after the failure of the Arab states in the wars against Israel. After the failure, the Palestinians knew they were on their own, and they formed their own militias and organizations. And so they tried to overthrow the King of Jordan and were ruthlessly put down. And so the Jordanians, for political purposes, couldn't kill them. Like, that would just be unacceptable. So they landed Yasser Arafat and the Palestinians militants without weapons. Actually, no, they were allowed to keep their weapons. But they were forced to leave Jordan. With the agreement of Syria, the Palestinian militants were transferred to Lebanon, and Lebanon became the next base of Palestinian resistance to the Israelis. And I know this very well because I'm Lebanese, and this caused a lot of problems. This caused the Lebanese Civil War only 5 years later. And what happened was the Palestinians were attacking Israel from the northern border. The Palestinians were attacking Israel from the Lebanese border, and the victims of Israeli retaliation were local Lebanese Shiites and Christians who were living in the south, next on the northern border of Israel. The Palestinians would launch attacks, the Israelis would shell them, Lebanese civilians would die. And not just that, they also tried to overthrow the Lebanese government as well to make it a base to continue the war with Israel. And this led to a very, very bad reaction from the Lebanese Christians. And the Lebanese Christians started forming their own militias, and they massacred Palestinians. The Palestinians massacred Christians. It went back and forth, and then Lebanese Shiites started massacring Palestinians as well because they were being fired upon by the Israelis, and it just becomes an entire shit show. The Lebanese Civil War is basically Game of Thrones in the Middle East, where every sect and religion has its own militia, and that throughout the entirety of the Lebanese Civil War, there were maybe, like, say, 20 sides or 20 clans. Every clan was at one point in the war an ally and a rival to every other clan. So it was a complete shit show, and it was completely basically Game of Thrones, in this tiny Middle Eastern country. And then what happens? The Israelis invade Lebanon. And then what happens? The Syrians invade Lebanon. The Syrians occupy and invade Lebanon. And then the Israelis and the Syrians are fighting each other in the territory of Lebanon. And this is an absolute shit show. And, are the Palestinians victims? Undeniably. But, again, like I said, there's no such thing as a perfect victim. Just because you are a victim of a crime one day doesn't mean, 2 years later, you are not a perpetrator of another crime. You can be a victim and a criminal at the same time. This is just the condition of human nature, I guess.
Well, and I think that is, and this is a bigger picture point to make. But, if we consider ourselves political realists, right, baked into that is that idea that, human beings have predictable ways that they behave, right? That human nature is a relative constant. And liberals are want to make the point. It's like, oh, how could you dehumanize someone by attributing all these sort of negative characteristics to them, making them into an animal. But in a weird way, they have sort of dehumanized the Palestinians and made the Palestinians into this kind of like noble savage. And so, as much as I have been kind of resistant to the narrative of quote unquote third worldism, right? I think that's kind of a psyop in the making. But nonetheless, I think it is important to look at how the liberals treat these people as like, I mean, literally like noble savages, the same way they talk about, Native Americans or Aboriginals or, colonized Africans. And to realize like that's not based just because it makes Israel angry, right? That is wrong.
Yeah. No, it is. And onto that point specifically, like when it comes to my background, like I said, I'm a Lebanese Christian. There were Palestinian Christians who killed Lebanese Christians, and there were Lebanese Christians who killed Palestinian Christians. This was there's no, we don't live in a Marvel movie, and that's always what the liberals are going back to. Like, oh, this is a Marvel movie, and all my enemies are Thanos, and all my enemies are Hitler, and so therefore whatever they do is completely immoral. Whenever I do is completely justified. That's just not how. That's how human beings think, but that's not how the world works. And on that point of the dehumanization, you are either a noble savage, and the Palestinians are not noble savages in many cases. Like the issue of Palestine, it's not a left-wing issue, or it's not just a left-wing issue. It's all a matter of perspective. The liberals and the progressives say, oh, the Palestinians are the brown people, the Israelis are the white people, and the white people are oppressing the brown people. That you can take that perspective. A lot of people do, but you could also say at the same time, what are these armed and dangerous radical European migrants doing on my land, taking over my territory, stealing my family farm? Like, I am defending my civilization. I am defending my culture. I am defending my people and my soil. Is that a left-wing issue? It's not. It's a matter of perspective, and that's what the reason why people think it's a left-wing issue is because the only people that talked about the case for Palestine for the past 60 years have been communists and socialists, and the Palestinians, the Palestinians, I think they made a wrong choice, but they explicitly sided with the international left post 1948. These Palestinians and the PLO specifically sided with the international left. Where does the meme of the one struggle come from? The meme of the one struggle comes from the alliance of the PLO and the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. And, the Irish Republican Army was a radical communist movement to expel the British. But is the IRA right wing? Or is the IRA left wing? On one hand, they're anti-imperial, but on the other hand, they're defending their homeland and their Catholic faith and the native land of Ireland, where they are the indigenous people. This is why it's so complicated, and this is why people don't really understand this issue.
Well, and I think that the Irish question is something fascinating. I'll probably have an Irishman on soon. I may see if I can reach out to Keith Woods to talk about what's currently happening there, because in a weird way, we're sort of seeing this kind of internal contradiction, right? Where, and let's also be honest, we haven't really directly talked about it, but a lot of this also has to do with Cold War intrigues, right? That, which group were you aligned with, right? Israel kind of flip-flopped from being a vaguely socialist country to, once Lacoon took power, to a Western world right-wing aligned power.
Yeah.
In quotes. But, Ireland's a great example of that as well, right? Which is like, well, okay, they're on one hand, they're sort of ethno-nationalists, right? And we're seeing that ethno-nationalism come out now in the face of mandatory diversity. But, all through the 20th century, they were very much aligned with, the Soviet bloc and the international left. And look, I realize, left and right are messy terms. They're becoming messier and messier as we kind of shed that Cold War paradigm. But nonetheless, I think it's an interesting question. So,
and this goes back to, whether either of these issues is left or right wing, it doesn't really matter. Robert Conquest's first law is always prescience. Everyone is conservative about what they love, about what they know best. The Palestinians, follow conquest first law. They're conservative about what they love, which is their land and their people. They might be left wing on many, many other issues, but everyone is an ethno nationalist for their own side.
So, Hunger, we are fast approaching time. If people want to find more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
You can just find me on Twitter at HungerDye, DYE, and I'm a guest on a few shows. I'll be on Use the Unix channel on Monday, I believe, and you can also check out if you're actually interested in more Middle Eastern history. Please, I don't have my own channel, but please check out my guest streams on my good friend Hitman. He's a British YouTuber, very very close friend, very good dude, especially one of our guys for sure. And we deep dive into Middle Eastern history and books about the Arabs in many of our streams, and those are very 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 fascinating checkouts if you're interested into more of the background of the Middle East.
Yeah, I need to reach out to Hitman. I think we could have an interesting conversation. Anyway,
He's
man,
a good dude.
Yeah, I've heard good things about him. Again, man, thank you so much for coming on. This was a fascinating discussion. I appreciate it.
Thank you, man. It's been a pleasure. I've been meaning to talk about this issue specifically, but just never got the opportunity.
Well, I'm glad I could be the format for that. As far as my stuff, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I have a Substack whenever I bother to update it. And then the best way to support us is by directly supporting Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching, our channel sponsor. I've been sick, as you can probably tell. So I've been out of the gym for a little bit, but eager to get back to it. JD and the other guys in the group chat are sure reminding me that I have skipped the gym, and I am gay for skipping the gym. And you know what? That's a solid reason to have a fitness group chat, right? I will also be at the OGC conference in June. There are still a few tickets left. I highly recommend you head out to that conference. Any number of guys that you know from this show, Thomas, Pete, myself, and Hunger will be there. So I highly recommend you going if you can swing it. And to everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.